Hola, hola. Buenos días. Buenos días, ¿cómo están? Ya se, ya se levantaron. eh, ya se levantaron. Buenas madrugadas, ¿no? 8 de la mañana, ¿cómo están? Muchachos, ahora sí estamos con una muy buena charla el día de hoy. Ojalá que la sigan, son las 8 de la mañana, obviamente. ¿Por qué a las 8 de la mañana? Van a decir, siempre lo hacemos en las tardes, donde ya tenemos un poquito más porque ya tenemos un poquito más de, más de tiempo, ya terminamos el día, tenemos más tiempo para escuchar a las charlas y demás. Bueno, hoy lo hicimos a las 8 de la mañana, ¿por qué? Porque nos estamos juntando con Europa. Hoy viene a hablar Donny Walls, ¿no? 5 herramientas para ayudarte a ser un mejor desarrollador iOS, ¿no? Y eso viene de mano de un gran desarrollador, un gran personaje en la comunidad europea sobre desarrollo en iOS, así que ojalá que la sigan. Él está en Ámsterdam, entonces obviamente pues tuvimos que mover un poquito el horario, pero como sea, la vamos a poder ver en la noche, ¿no? Ahorita estamos en vivo y vamos a hacerlo, pero la vamos a retransmitir también en la noche, por si quieren verla, volver a verla en la noche, adelante, ¿no? Bienvenidos a Kodemia a las 8 de la mañana. Ojalá que tengan un gran día, que sea muy productivo para todos, que tienen muchas líneas de código, pero sobre todo que se diviertan haciendo código, ya sea web, mobile o el tipo de código que estén haciendo. Ojalá que se diviertan, ¿no? Bueno, hoy les traemos, muchachos, obviamente, prepárense, ¿no? Acudan al verbo to be, encomiéndense al verbo to be, ¿no? Porque obviamente hoy la charla de hoy es en inglés, será en inglés. Entonces simplemente ahorita vamos a switchar a inglés, pero pues hoy justo tenemos esta charla que es 5 herramientas para ayudarlos a convertirse en un mejor desarrollador iOS, ¿no? Y para eso nos acompaña, bueno, antes recordarles, ¿no? Nosotros somos Kodemia, ¿no? Kodemia es la primera academia real para programadores, es decir, somos una academia, somos una agencia de desarrollo, somos una academia, por supuesto, pero primero somos una comunidad de desarrolladores, ¿no? Entonces, bienvenidos y obviamente pues hay mucho entrenamiento de este lado, muchos talleres, muchas pláticas, mucho contenido, ¿no? Están los bootcamps, muchísimas cosas que hacemos para ayudarle a la gente en Latinoamérica a que siga avanzando en este proceso de aprender desarrollo, ¿no? Y lo hacemos hacia las personas, ¿no? No nos dedicamos a los cursos, nos dedicamos a las personas, ¿no? A transformar la vida de las personas, eso es lo que hacemos y lo hacemos programando en comunidad, ¿no? Eh, Nos dedicamos a que a cada una de las personas que viene a la academia y a la comunidad, pues logre su objetivo, ¿no? Hasta verlos que se convierten en desarrolladores y que luego esa oportunidad se convierte real, ¿no? Y es tangible y entonces terminan trabajando, terminan emprendiendo o ayudando a su emprendimiento o terminan freelanceando. ¿Qué es lo que quieren hacer? Pues entonces ahí es donde nos dedicamos y hasta que veamos que eso es tangible es en donde no es que terminemos nuestro trabajo, pero digamos que cumplimos, ¿no? Cumplimos con la primera parte que nos toca, ¿no? Siempre lo hemos hecho en presencial, hemos tenido muchos eventos presenciales, estén atentos a los eventos presenciales porque ya vuelven, ¿no? Ya hicimos el primero y vendrán muchos eventos presenciales, pero parte de la comunidad siempre creció en presencial, así que hoy todos estos eventos que estamos haciendo así, eh, los hacemos en línea, ¿no? Siempre crecimos con esta metodología live learning que era aprender en línea, ¿no? Incluso cuando lo hacíamos en presencial. Entonces ahora lo hacemos en línea, ojalá que en algún momento, este sábado hay un evento en línea que es privado, donde vamos a tener más de 50 desarrolladores de la comunidad y entre egresados, los mentores y algunos invitados de la comunidad que hemos seleccionado, pues vamos a tener un evento en línea bastante padre, que ya les pasaremos el resumen, ¿no? Bueno, pues entonces ya, yo quiero presentarles ya a 7 de diciembre, bueno, aquí me está poniendo producción, 7 de diciembre, no se pierdan, hay una sesión informativa para Backbase, para esta beca del 80%. Hoy justo vamos a hablar con uno de los integrantes y quien hace entrenamiento para Backbase, ¿no? Eh, entonces tenemos como invitado, por supuesto, a Donny Walls, ¿no? Donny Walls es desarrollador, es un máster desarrollador, ¿no? Perteneciente a la comunidad de desarrollo, y con varios libros en su haber, ¿no? Sobre desarrollo iOS. Entonces, bueno, yo quiero darle la bienvenida si quieren, entonces, para comenzar y para arrancarnos, ¿no? Al final nos vamos a quedar. Vayan planteando sus preguntas, por favor. Planteen sus preguntas, díganos de dónde son y váyanos diciendo todo lo que tengan, porque al final lo vamos a resolver con Donny y nos vamos a quedar después de su charla. Nos vamos a quedar unos minutos con él platicando, ¿vale? Así que, pues yo quiero darle entonces si les parece, la bienvenida a Donny en este momento. Hey, Donny.
Hey, hello. Hi.
How are you?
Doing all right. Thanks for the introduction. My Spanish isn't great, so I'm not sure what you said, but I'm sure it was all good things.
Well, practically I say that you're God in iOS, and we all should, get on our knees,
Well, thank you.
I was introducing you, like everything we just talked a few minutes before, and saying what the subject we're going to try today: 5 tools to help you become a better developer in iOS.
Yes. I actually came up with a couple more when I was writing the talk, but there's 5 key tools that we want to talk about today.
Cool. Well, Donny, I have a lot of questions, but I'll leave it to the end, and I think I'm gonna write some more during your talk.
Sounds fantastic.
Sounds great for you.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Well, welcome. This is the community of Kodemia. There are like 10 guys watching you, and I hope they become someday not like you. I want they become what they are, but learning from an expert like you. So
yeah, I hope it's going to be some useful tools for them, and I hope that it's going to be a little bit of a higher level talk, not too technical, to help give some tools to excel at development, I would say, in the end.
Yeah, sure. Well, guys, pay attention to Donny. He's a great expert. He has books. He's part of the community of iOS developers. He leads some great ideas. So pay attention to Donny, and we'll talk after his presentation.
Perfect.
So, Donny, what are these 5 tools? Tell us, please.
All right. Yes. Okay, so 5 tools to help you become a better iOS developer. Before we get into that, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Donny. I am currently an iOS developer, but I wasn't always that. I started off actually as with a study in communication and multimedia design, which means that I was initially focused on learning how to design products that people want to use, highly focused on building interfaces that are easy to use for people, building a couple of prototypes with code, but really my studies initially were not about coding at all. So I had to learn and figure out how to become a good developer all on my own, of course with help from a lot of great people, but it's not that I studied coding, so I'm not coming from a place where I say, oh, in college we learned this. These are all things that I've picked up and things that I've learned during my career while I was actually going through the motions of becoming better at development. So as I was studying, I interned as a front-end developer. And what I did there is I initially was hired to build a couple of simple prototypes, which quickly spiraled out of control because I was having so much fun with it. I was building things in Flash and ActionScript, which if you're new to programming, you have no idea what those are. But back in, 2008 probably or earlier, we had these amazing interactive, almost video-like websites that were built with a technology called Adobe Flash. And they were awesome, but eventually they got completely wiped out because Apple didn't want to have Flash web pages on the iPad. And so that's what I did as an internship. And after that, I went into backend for a little bit. So I did PHP, Python, JavaScript, all kinds of different things. And after that, I finally switched into iOS. And that's about 5 to 6 years ago right now. So I did a lot of different things before settling on iOS. And as you can imagine, I learned a lot of different different points of view on a lot of different kind of interesting topics. And currently, in addition to iOS, I am an author, speaker, and engineer. So I do a lot of different things. When I'm not programming, I'll be teaching or writing about programming or anything that involves a mix of doing that. And I'm iOS trainer for Backbase. So this talk, of course, is on behalf of Backbase for a bit. And at Backbase, I help people use Backbase's SDKs because we make software for banks. And of course, if you make software for banks to use and integrate, you need somebody to tell these banks and partners and teams how to do that. And I help Backbase do that currently, in addition to a bunch of other things. Okay, so it's actually going to do the animation twice. That's fine. So how do I become a better iOS developer? And this is something that I've asked during my career many, many times, not just for iOS, but just in general. How do I advance to a next level? Like, it's fun that I can build this interactive page in Flash today, but this thing needs some data from a remote server. How do I do that? How do I become better at development? How do I level myself up? How do I get to a place where I can build this instead of always asking everybody for help? So if you ask that question and then somebody gives you some answers, you'll get something like, oh, you should probably follow a couple more tutorials, or you should just build something, anything at all, just see what you can come up with. Or maybe somebody will tell you to put your code up on GitHub so that other people can see it and give you some feedback on it, and hope that somehow it kind of picks up and that a lot of people will be telling you how to do better. Or buy a lot of courses. If you go on YouTube, you'll find a bunch of people telling you like, oh, purchase this course, purchase that course, purchase that book, because that will help you work through all the projects and you'll become a master of this technology in a couple of weeks. Or in the end, people will say practice, practice, practice. Now, these are 5 points, but these are not the 5 points that I'm willing to make, because when I see this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, that's all well and good, and this advice is not bad by any means. It's actually quite good advice to go through some tutorials and to buy a bunch of books or courses. But in the end, I think these advices are all focused on keeping you focused on that one technology, on that one path of getting into learning something for the very first time. And of course, you want to eventually be somebody with reasonable knowledge, a little bit of expertise, maybe even, and still grow at that point. So what's a book or a course for a beginner going to do for you in 3 years, in 5 years, in 6 years? Probably not as much as it does in the very, very beginning. So I have for you a couple more broader tips. And these are all tips that I picked up in the past, 13 or so years of me programming and changing disciplines and getting better at this. And these are all things that I think are very important if you want to be a great developer, not just an iOS developer, but just a great developer. So the first tip I have is all about reading. But reading is quite possibly one of the best things that you can do for your career. And one thing that I've learned is that the older books are not always outdated, right? Some examples of good books that are sometimes universally considered super good or sometimes considered a little bit controversial, but think of books like Clean Code or maybe The Pragmatic Programmer and a bunch of others. And what these books contain is not necessarily a lot of code for you to adopt right away, but they also contain a lot of principles and a lot of ideas that, even though the books are sometimes 10, 20 years old, are still super relevant today. And for example, how do you separate concerns within a code base, or how do you take a pragmatic approach to problem solving? So even if you see a book where you're like, this isn't about Swift, this isn't about Xcode, this isn't about iOS, and it's 15 years old, that doesn't mean that it's a bad book. It's actually possible that if somebody recommends that book to you today, that it's one of the best books that you can read to advance your career. Also, don't focus on books that only cover your programming language of choice. A very good example of a book that I read not too long ago is Design Patterns by the Gang of Four. And that's a book that primarily focuses on Java and C-like languages But it's not about the programming language in these books. It's all about the principles and the patterns that they teach. And the nice thing is that because they teach the patterns mostly, that the code kind of makes sense when you look at it, even if it's not the programming language that you're used to. And in the end, you're picking up bits and pieces of that programming language, which is incredibly useful down the line. And if you're doing that, go even further. Make sure that you check out books on non-programming topics too. And one example that I always give is the Mythical Man Month, which is a book not so much about programming, but it's a book about time management, project management, and all that stuff in tech-related teams. So it'll teach you things like what happens if you have a team of a couple developers, and you add somebody when the project's already late. How can you make sure that you do that in an efficient way? And how can you convince maybe your manager or your boss that expanding the team from 3 to 9 people is not going to triple your output? It's probably actually going to only increase your output by maybe double, possibly less. So these are all interesting topics to get into if you're also learning how to become a professional programmer, because they can take your knowledge that much further. And also, this is my favorite one, favorite books that teach you concepts instead of only recipes. Right? Books can teach you how to do things, and they can show you how to build an app, and that can be very, very useful. But if you have a book on how something actually works, or on the actual concept behind the application or the design patterns behind the applications, you'll find that you walk away with a very solid understanding of what it is that you were doing versus just a couple of commands or code snippets that you've memorized and can now copy paste into a project without actually knowing what they do. So what are the key gains from that tip, right? From reading, what's the main thing to take from that? One is curiosity, right? By reading all these broad topics, that trains your curiosity, which is a very important trait of a good developer. But it also builds generalist knowledge. There's always this distinction between should I be a generalist or an expert, and you can be a little bit of both. And we call that a T-shaped developer, right? Where you know a little bit about a lot of things, but one thing is your expertise, and that could be iOS or anything that you want. And it helps place your profession in a larger context to have a broad knowledge base to draw from, right? If you know what happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you get a better sense of like, oh, this is what I'm working on, and this is a solved problem for a while now, or oh, hey, this is weird, this is new. It's just nice to have that context. At least I find it very nice. Okay. Tip 2, do not rely on tutorials all the time. This is something that I hear from people a lot, and a tutorial, it makes sense that people say this, right? Don't rely on tutorials all the time, because a tutorial is often just a step-by-step instruction of how to do something, and it often contains very little background information. I'm not saying that all tutorials are like this. Some tutorials provide excellent background information, but a lot of them are just, oh, hey, let's build something, and here's the code how to do it, or here's the end result, and copy paste a bunch of snippets, and that's it, which is not always what you're looking for, right? It can be a great way to introduce something for the first time, but in the end, you'll want that deeper knowledge to make sure that you understand what you're doing. And if the author of a tutorial or the presenter in a tutorial is really good, you'll understand why you're doing something versus just doing whatever they told you to do. And again, they're a great way to introduce yourself to something that you do not know much about yet. I follow tutorials all the time when I want to see a new technology without thinking about it too much, just to kind of get a sense for, oh, okay, this is something I can do with it, or oh, it takes this much code to build something simple as a to-do list, or just a couple quick concepts to kind of anchor in my mind, like where is something at, like how complex is something. But then to actually do some deep learning, I would move away from tutorial and then build it on my own. And at all costs, you want to avoid what I often hear referred to as tutorial hell, right? A lot of people will be studying tutorials for months, and sometimes they'll come out of it saying, I've seen all these things and I've built all these sample apps. Like, look at my GitHub, there's 15 projects there. But they're still not quite sure how to do something on their own. And they're kind of stuck in that place where they can follow tutorials and understand exactly what they're doing in the tutorial, but they haven't made the knowledge their own yet. So they're kind of stuck there. But you really don't want that. So what are the key gains from that tip, from not relying on tutorials all the time? that improved your problem-solving skills. But if you don't rely on tutorials for everything and just try and take bits and pieces where needed, you'll be stuck solving problems on your own a lot more often, which is not a bad thing. It's actually pretty good to be stuck sometimes because that will help you pick apart the problem you're facing and eventually solve the problem. And that also helps you understand better why you do something, right? If a tutorial tells you over and over again, oh, do this like that, oh, do this like that, and they don't tell you exactly why, it can be easy to not question that. And that also ties into curiosity that I talked about earlier. If you have that curiosity, you'll find yourself asking why in a lot of tutorials. And maybe that's a sign for you that that tutorial is okay for the brief introduction, but you have a bunch of follow-up research to do after following it. And not relying on tutorials also helps adopt a pragmatic mindset where you're able to like pick problems apart and solve them as you encounter them, and get better at solving problems using that mindset over time. And that also kind of nicely ties into my next tip, which is learn to navigate documentation, right? If you're not going to rely on tutorials all the time, then you're going to have to rely heavily on documentation. So learning to navigate documentation, how do you do that? Well, it's tricky because documentation is not the most exciting thing to read. Right? Documentation is pretty boring, it's slow, it's often very technical, it's often very much focused on teaching you the correct way of doing something versus doing it the fun way or the exciting way, or it doesn't focus on having you produce that result real quick like a tutorial does. It's really focused on explaining to you, this is what we're doing, this is why it works like that, this is how you call it, this is how it's used in context, maybe a little bit for good documentation, but it's generally just not very exciting. There's also often more information and documentation than you might have expected. And I know for iOS developers, this is a bit of a weird statement to make because Apple's recent work has had often a little less information than you would want. But a lot of the old stuff Apple had and a lot of the parts of Apple's frameworks that are really well documented have a ton of information. And sometimes you're just wondering, hey, I just want to set up a database for my app. How do I do that? How does that work? How do I get what I want? And then Apple will be like, oh, here's our documentation for the database. And here's the type of database that it is. And here's how you can configure it. And all you're thinking is, I don't care that there's 5 ways to configure this database. I want to have one that works for me. And while it's not as satisfying to plow through all that information, you do walk away with a deeper understanding than you would ever have had if somebody only showed you the quick and dirty way of setting it up and the quick way of using something. And knowing how to read, explore, and navigate this documentation, right? Knowing how to filter the information is an incredibly useful skill for a developer to have. Because especially if you go for more obscure frameworks or for more obscure technologies, you'll find that the number of resources to learn from diminishes to near zero sometimes, and you're just on your own. And if you don't know how to read or explore and navigate documentation, it's going to be really tricky for you to figure out what it is that you need to do to get your program working. So if you do this often, if you practice this often, you'll be able to digest this boring information much quicker, and you'll be able to pick out the parts that are interesting to you much faster. So what are the key gains from doing that, right? The key gains from reading documentation? Well, it improves your ability to search and find information, not just within the documentation, but also outside of it, because the documentation often contains the technical term for something, right? Or it will contain some links to other documentation. And just having seen those terminologies and having seen these other places and other information sources will help you find other information too. And so the more you explore on your own, the better you'll get at exploring. It's a matter of practicing, and I've been doing that for a very long time, just especially because when I started 10 years ago, we had to search way more on our own than we have now, because YouTube, for example, was just starting to get bigger. There weren't a ton of programming videos on YouTube yet. So, having to search more will actually train that for you. And when you get to the documentation, it will help you breaking down problems into smaller parts. And the reason that's the case is that the documentation is often much more focused than a tutorial is, for example. A documentation is just about how do I make a network call? What happens when I call this save function on my database? What could go wrong? What can go right? And instead of focusing on a whole app as one whole thing like you would in a tutorial, you have to focus on these small bits and pieces because there's no documentation for the whole thing by default. Okay. Tip 4, and this is possibly one tip that, in my opinion, I made it tip 4, but it should have been tip number 0 or tip number 1 with all capitals, because this is a very important one in my opinion. To participate in the community, you'll find out that you're not the only one learning. Right? If you have a good community, and I have to say iOS is probably one of the better communities that I've been in terms of helping people learning, you'll find that there's tons of other people out there learning and struggling with the same things you are. And if you want to join a community for iOS, I recommend that you type ios-developers.io in your web browser and get a Slack invite for a Slack group that I have been in for the past, 5 to 6 years, as long as I've been doing iOS. And it's an amazing place where we have a whole bunch of experts and we have a whole bunch of beginners, and we're all just communicating with each other. Beginners can ask any kind of question, and if anybody can help them, they will be helped. You'll find beginners helping each other. You'll find beginners learning together, and that is really, really amazing. And even if you see a question from an expert, a question that you don't understand, and whether that's on Slack or some forum, just reading along with what these other people that are maybe a couple levels above your knowledge level, reading along with what these people are doing can be so, so helpful. A lot of the things that I have learned over the last few years were learned by seeing other people struggle with something. And sometimes, interestingly enough, it's somebody who's only been programming for a couple of months that asks a question, and you just think to yourself, actually, I'm not sure either. I've never thought about this. And then somebody will come in with decades of experience and explain this, and just reading that conversation, and you're just thinking to yourself, wow, I just learned something simply by participating in the community, simply by being there, simply by actively reading along. And you don't have to be there to teach others all the time. And what's also nice is that if you're in a community, and there's local communities and global communities, of course, and if you're in a community, you're building a network, right? You're building friendships, you're building these connections with all these people. And when the time comes to find a job or switch jobs or anything, it can be so much easier when you have a good network, because these people can help you prepare for interviews, but also recommend you for jobs. So it's not just about learning, it's also about career building that you can do with a community. So again, some key gains from participating in a community. I really cannot stress enough how valuable that network of experts is, right? For both getting help with questions you might have, for both getting experiences from other people, just having fun conversations, but also seeking a new job or preparing for job interviews. It's incredibly, incredibly useful. And what's also important is this helps improve your ability to ask questions, right? Because as you participate in this community, people will ask you for clarifications. If you just ask, how do I do X? Probably this other person is going to ask, what have you tried so far? Why are you trying to do that? What are you trying to achieve? So learning how to ask better questions is incredibly useful in the end. And it's also an opportunity to test your own knowledge, right? You can try to help other people and sort of, especially if it's a friendly community where if you might not be 100% correct, somebody will just kindly step in and help you do better. That's really useful, and it's an opportunity to help test your own knowledge by trying to teach others. Okay, and then my 5th tip, step outside of your comfort zone. And I hope that by now you're also seeing that there's a little bit of a pattern going on here in all of these tips, which is curiosity, right? In every single of these tips, I'm encouraging you to be proactive and learn and soak up knowledge from other people and to kind of explore. And that's the exact same thing with tip 5, right? So stepping outside of your comfort zone, because being a developer is about more than just programming, right? If you're only sitting there writing Swift code for your iOS project, you're going to be really good at that probably, but there's so much more outside of programming that you should be learning to be a really good, excellent developer. And your comfort zone is probably larger than you might think. For example, if you think to yourself, oh, I know what I'll do to step out of my comfort zone. I am going to build a camera app. That's still right? That's still Swift. That's still within that little bubble that you're in. That's still within your iOS bubble. I'm not saying that it's not useful to build something that you might not build otherwise, but I'm saying that your comfort zone is probably larger than you might think. Even if you would say, oh, I'm going to use Swift to build a server, that's probably still a little bit inside of your comfort zone because you're still using that same programming language, it's still the same IDE, and you're still doing things in a similar way. And you're going to find that you're talking to the same people about this. So what I find important is to learn different languages and platforms, and that will make working within your main platform a lot easier. And as I explained in the beginning of this talk, I came from a front-end background, right? And I moved into back-end and eventually into iOS programming. And even though these things are all vastly different and they're entirely different platforms, entirely different programming languages, every time I switched from one platform or language to the next, it was so much easier the more I did it. Because in the end, all these programming languages build on so much common ground, which also ties back into the first tip that I gave with the reading. Right? If you're reading things that are not per se about your programming language, you'll notice that there's so much patterns, so much similarities across the board that will help you just grow and understand and place yourself inside of this whole world much, much better. And what's also nice is that if at any point you have to transition to another language, you may have already learned it a little bit. Or if you're in a new job where somebody's like, oh, hey, you're doing iOS, right? And you just say, yeah, I'm also doing iOS. Like, oh, could you maybe help out with the backend a little bit? If you've never done that, that's going to be super scary and it's not comfortable for you to do that. But if you've been practicing that over and over again, and if you've been kind of dabbling in different technologies, you might say, hey, okay, sure, I've never done Ruby before, but I can build a backend in Ruby with you probably if you take the lead. And I mean, I've done Python, I've done JavaScript. I can learn this language too. Like you're comfortable with being uncomfortable. You've done it before. And that is incredibly valuable to be that flexible and to be that adaptive to what you don't know yet. So one last slide of key gains from a tip. Again, curiosity. Like I think that is probably the key thing that I want you to take away from this. From any tip that I've given, curiosity is super important. And the more you follow these 5 tips, the more your curiosity will be trained. And again, stepping outside of your comfort zone puts your work into a larger context. And I talked about T-shaped developers earlier in the talk, right, where I said you might not want to be a generalist all around, but having some general knowledge and being an expert in like 1 or 2 things, which makes you a so-called T-shaped developer, that's very attractive to companies and it's very attractive to be because that means that you are very flexible and that you can do a lot of things and that you've seen a lot of things as well. That you have that sort of broad knowledge pool to draw from. And that's very important because the more resources you have to draw from, the better of a developer you can become. So one last thing that I want to add, right? We had the tips. We had do some reading, participate in community. We had we had reading. We had community participation. We had comfort zone, and we had 2 others that I'm totally blanking on right now. I'm sorry about that. But in addition to these 5 tips, there is a mindset that I want you to focus on. And that mindset is possibly more important than any tip that I can give you. And there's this quote that I have no idea who said that first, but dress for the job you want, not for the job you have, right? And I like to translate that into think like the developer you want to be, right? Like ask yourself, what does the developer that I want to be do? What does the developer that I want to be uh, do in the morning? Like what's their work discipline like? What does their day look like? And try to follow that. So some overall tips to in that area, right? Like sort of what I try and do when I ask myself like what should I be doing today? I'll just think like what would somebody that I look up to do today? And again, be curious because it's possibly your most important skill. The moment you stop being curious is the moment you stop learning. It's the moment you stop trying new things. It's the moment that you stop evolving as a developer. So keep asking why, keep digging into things. Also, be pragmatic, right? Use what you need, solve problems that you have. Something that a lot of developers will do is they will solve problems they don't have, or they will, go all in on doing something super complicated when they don't have to do that. That's a skill that you can learn, and that's an attitude that I think is very important to have. Be humble. You don't have to know everything. I don't know everything. There's probably more that I do not know about just iOS than that I do know about iOS. However, because I'm curious, there's a lot of things that I can learn and a lot of things that I will know if I ever need to. And also try and help others where you can. I think this is something important to give back, right? Especially if you're doing that community participation, give back to people, right? If you've been helped a lot by other people, there's really a lot of satisfaction in seeing somebody new to the community and helping them out a little bit wherever you can. Of course, this ties in nicely with you don't have to know everything. You cannot help everybody. But if there's somebody that has a question, you know the answer, go for it. Like help them out a little bit. It's the least you can do for, being a good developer, and also helping others solidifies your own knowledge, which is great. And lastly, do not let your enthusiasm get in the way of great work. Right, that sort of ties into saying that you should be curious, and that all sort of comes together with this can-do attitude where you really want to do everything. Sometimes that means that your work might suffer if you move too quickly, if you keep racing through things and don't think things through too much. That's something I see good developers do a lot is they'll be quiet, they'll listen for a bit, kind of think something over, and then they'll do a fantastic job versus just being enthusiastic about it, running in and doing what they have to do. So that's sort of the extra bonus tips that I mentioned at the beginning. I have 5 main tips, and then these overall attitude tips that I think are very useful to keep in your mind. And of course, look at developers you respect, look at developers you find interesting and really good, and try and figure out some of the things they do and try to incorporate those into your own mindset. And lastly, be flexible and ready to adapt. This sort of also comes into learning other things, learning things that are not programming related. If you are not flexible, if you're not curious, then it's all going to sort of stagnate a little bit, and you're not going to improve as much as you could when you are flexible, when you are curious. And with that, I would like to thank you. I hope these are a lot of useful tips, a lot of useful little points for you to help you become a better developer. And I'll take some questions if we have them.
Thank you for that, Donny. I think. What do you think about this? If we look at your tips, more globally, more generalistic, I think I said that we need to focus on why instead
Yes.
of what, because once you focus on why is this happening? Why he's telling me this? Why you'll find in the reading good stuff. You'll be navigating in the right tutorials. Not just those that tell you what to do. They
Yeah,
tell you why. Why is this happening? You know, that's
exactly.
that's what you're looking for in books, and that's what you're looking for in the community. The community not just tell you what to do; they tell you why.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why is your mistake? You know.
Yeah. And that's also something funny that you see a lot is somebody will come in and ask, how do I do this? And then the first thing somebody is asking you is, why do you want to do this? What is the problem you're solving? Right? I
Exactly.
could tell you how to do this, but it might be the entirely wrong solution for the problem that you're solving.
Exactly.
And sometimes it turns out that, especially somebody who's maybe not super familiar with what they're doing, it might turn out they're overcomplicating things massively in their mind. Or maybe they're exactly on the right track and they are, in fact, indeed just looking for that one missing piece of the puzzle. But
Yeah.
asking why helps get so much better answers.
Yeah. It tells you, and it helps you to step out of this comfort zone. You know.
Yep.
That maybe you're looking for something that it's already done, and you don't have to do it once again. It's already done. You just take it and uh, uh, you know use it.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, even I'm currently working on a project where we are changing a bunch of things up and we kind of decided like, let's see what happens when we do things completely opposite of how we're doing them now, just as a thought exercise. Like we think something should live in this layer of the application. What if we put it somewhere else completely? And working with one other person on that, and we're constantly looking at each other and saying, I don't like this at all, but we are struggling to explain why we don't like it, and that's the fun part of it because it's like we see a lot of good things in making that change, and then when we ask why do we not like this, why is this uncomfortable for us, we're just like because it's not what we're used to, but that's the best reason we can come up with sometimes, and then you realize how important it is to get out of that comfort zone because sometimes you're just doing things because you're used to them, and kind of questioning that every once in a while is a really good exercise.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Donny, you said that tutorials. There are a lot of tutorials today. There's a free.
Yes.
It's full of free tutorials in YouTube. And I think I'm thankful for the people that make this, but I think it should be not wrong, but bad focusing if I just go to tutorials. I think today a great formula against this a lot of tutorials. It's the community. It's a mentor. It's people who you admire, in programming, and
Yeah.
go with them and ask them.
Yeah. Like I want to emphasize that because it's easy to read into that tutorial thing that I said, like, don't do too many of them as me saying tutorials are bad. And I'm not saying that at all. Like tutorials are incredibly useful resources, but it's very important to follow them and ask that question, why am I doing this? And if you find a teacher that's only showing you how to, copy paste some code and not explaining what they're doing, probably want to find another video or another resource where somebody is at least attempting to explain why they do what they do and helping you investigate further after the tutorial. Because if there's nothing to do after the tutorial, it might be a useful introduction. Like I follow tutorials all the time. If I'm like, oh, what does that look like? Like, what does the end result look like? I just want to see a little bit of code to kind of get a sense of what to do. That it's great for that. But if you want to do deep learning, make sure you step out of these tutorials at some point and find deeper resources like a mentor, like a community.
I remember that when I was learning, Tony. Yeah, I have a lot of tutorials, but instead of that, I was looking for people that I can admire, that make me say wow on when they were doing, and go with them. So there was this people, this person that I was like, hey, how did you do this? How can I do this? And he was like, once again, you? Yeah, me. Yeah, man, it's me once again. Can you help me?
Yeah,
But
but there's nothing
also,
wrong with that. Ask like as long as you ask good questions and as long as your questions keep getting better, you're not asking the exact same over and over. It shows you're learning and growing, and that's great, and that's what the community is for.
Tony, you have, like you said, 5 or 6 years as an iOS developer. Uh, what do you say that makes you what you are today? Uh, you
Yeah,
know,
uh, I think a big part of that is like I share that roadmap I had in the beginning for a reason. That's I had to learn things a lot of times, right? Because I switch technologies so often, and I would say that that has helped me so much. Like going from I was doing Python for the backend at that point, and the company I worked for asked, "We want to have an iOS app. Do we hire somebody? Like, do we find a new employee? Do we get a freelancer?" And initially they said, "We'll get a freelancer." And I said, "Well, I would love to learn how to build apps. So can I like get like half a day or a day a week to work with this guy, like to kind of look what he's doing and at some point work towards facing him out of the company again and taking it internal." And the company was like, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea." And that was so much fun because that was the what was it, fourth, fifth time learning something new, and I had experience like how do I approach this. I had a way of learning that was comfortable for me, and I would say that constant learning and constant curiosity and constantly also being confronted with good and bad learning resources has put me where I am today because I just love helping people learn now because I've done so much of it myself and still am, by the way. Like I am by no means finished learning iOS, not even close.
I think because you're not uh, you're never even close of what you want to do.
No, no. This the more I learn, the more I see that I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Well, let me just remind to our community, to the coders, what are you doing today? You're writing books. You are part of the community. You are a developer. You have a startup. Uh, Tell us.
Yeah, so I don't have a startup. I work with a startup.
Oh, you work with.
As yeah, yeah I have only one company, and that's just my own that I publish the books and everything through. So, uh, in a given week, I will probably be producing some training stuff for Backbase. I'll be helping teams grow and helping them improve their code bases and solve some Swift UI or combine questions. I also help a startup with adopting Swift UI because they're very new and they're on the latest iOS version and they're just going all in on Swift UI, which is a ton of fun. And when I'm not working for them, I'll be writing on my blog, working on my books, or doing talks like this one or hosting workshops. There's a lot of different things that I can do in a week, which is a ton of fun.
Well, that's a lot. So
Mhm.
you're participating as an active part of back-based training. That's what made us know each other. Uh,
Mhm.
you're part of this training. So the coders, the freshers or the back-basers that will be training with us in this scholarship. There's a scholarship, Johnny, of 80%.
So I've heard, yes,
That's
that's awesome.
did you have this opportunity?
I did not. No, no, but that's amazing. That's really good.
I wish I wish being studying once again. so
Yes.
these backbasers, these freshers that going into this bootcamp with backbase for iOS, I think will be working with you. Uh,
Yeah, they'll be seeing a bunch of me, and of course there's other trainers as well. So if you like this, there's no guarantee that you'll get me if you join Backbase at some point, but there's a good chance that you'll at some point interact with me for sure.
I have two questions just to close this webinar. What um, once again, this against or with these tutorials, because there's no tutorials or boot camps or something else. It's a network. It's you build a network of knowledge. Tutorials, mentors, boot camps. How do you see these boot camps? Working today with the companies.
I haven't seen that a ton just yet. I've been involved in a few boot camps where they had worked with a few companies, and I mean, I just love the idea of training people in a couple months and actually have them ready to go to work, right? And because these boot camps tend to work closely with companies, like asking the companies, what do you need? What's the roles that you're going to be placing these people in? All the knowledge that you gain is so highly practical, so useful, and I think that is possibly more useful than following a whole education of 4 years where you learn a lot of things, and then in your first job you realize that you're only going to be using a small part of it. So yeah, I like that about boot camps and companies working together because you get highly focused training, which is incredibly useful.
And today there's a lot of time that you save, Donnie.
For sure, yeah.
Well, Donnie estará mentoreando los freshers del bootcamp. No, no, Donnie will be mentoring bootcamp freshers of Backbase. No, not directly, no directamente, but maybe, pero tal vez, when they be working with Backbase, maybe they find him, mentoring. Ya cuando estén trabajando con Backbase, seguramente se lo van a encontrar por ahí, mentoreando en un siguiente nivel, ¿no? In the next level, Donnie. So,
yep.
One last question, Donnie. What do you see in mobile development in the future?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think what we'll see is a lot more applications focused on probably things like artificial reality or virtual reality. I think we've sort of settled currently in a space where most of our applications are clients on top of a server, right? Like most apps that you have on your phone today are just similar to websites, more powerful, way more complex than a website, but their main job will be to do something that a website could also do. And I feel like we're probably going to move towards apps that use your camera a lot more, towards apps that are probably more focused on showing you visual information and visual things, which sounds very vague, I know. But like really in context of where you are and what you're doing, which is something that you don't really get out of a web page, for example. They're much more about providing you some information. Um, and yeah, like if this is sort of also a question, like is Swift, for example, do you think that's going to go away in favor of Flutter or React Native? I don't really see that happening because just because Apple and Google both move so much quicker than these hybrid frameworks ever can, it would be weird to see them replaced. Would it be a bad thing if they got replaced at some point? I don't know, but I don't think that's something that we'll see in the future, in the near future. I think mobile is going to keep growing, keep evolving, keep finding its spot where it's really good at.
Yeah, like just like that, replacing iOS or Kotlin today. It's gonna be hard. It's gonna be hard. It's gonna be a lot of years, and I don't see that happening. I see uh, those languages and frameworks using for maybe small applications. Like something. But if you want a big app, you need to native language.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, and you mentioned this Apple and Google. Uh, what do you see as an advantage from learning iOS today? I think we should learn iOS and Android, but what do you see as an advantage learning iOS?
That's a good one and a hard one to answer. Like they both have their up and downsides, right? A downside of Android is just the fragmentation. You have to support devices that are super old. Um, iOS, on the other hand, is much more up to date typically, so you're able to use newer technologies more easily often. although Apple's backwards compatible or Google's backwards compatibility story is much better. Google does much more work to make sure that what they have in new Android versions can be used in older ones. Apple completely ignores that. But I do find that Apple's entire ecosystem just feels a little bit more friendly and a little bit nicer to work in and to work with. So that's sort of why I favor it. I don't want to get into one's better than the other because it's very much preference, and they both have pros and cons for sure.
No, not the ground we want to touch.
Yeah.
Well, what would you like to see in the next version of iOS, and not maybe not iOS, maybe Xcode, maybe Swift?
Oof. That's a great question. I'm not sure. I always used to say network debugging, but they put that in Xcode 13.
Yeah.
So I have to come up with something new.
Well, but maybe something new for those features is the debugging of those features.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly, I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. Or like just in general, I would love to see Apple take SwiftUI even further because SwiftUI is doing a lot in iOS 15 and even more, even easier. I hope they put a ton of focus on that.
I
I
think
don't need a lot of new features. I just want SwiftUI to be better and better and better.
better, more powerful. I think
Yeah.
more light, maybe.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah. So something like that.
Well, Bonnie, I'd like to repeat this talking. I'd like to maybe just give us a chance to talk more to these features. I really wish that happened. Uh, Maybe talking about these features, maybe talking about the building of an app. Maybe a lot of we I think we touched today these soft skills that are very needed today. No,
Mhm.
you have these hard skills that it's programming, and you need these soft skills in the same level. Uh,
Yep.
Maybe next, I hope we have a next talk, and we'll talk about coding. What do
Sure.
you
Let's see. Yeah. Let's stay in touch and see what we can do.
Well, cool. Well, one last message, Donny, for Mexico, for these coders.
Stay curious. Stay learning. You got this.
You got this. Exactly. Well, thank you, Donny. Thank you to all the coders. I remember you. Bueno, les recuerdo, ya me seguí con el inglés. Les recuerdo que hoy tenemos la retransmisión de este webinar a las 8 de la noche, donde pondremos ya un poquito de subtítulos, si lo quieren ver ya con subtítulos. Pero lo que más les recomiendo es el inglés. Donny, English. I think we missed that. English.
There's a lot of resources in English. Yes.
The best resources are in English.
Yes.
Including Donny. Well, thank you for this, Donny. I think if you stay like 2 or 3 minutes more, just to say goodbye. It's gonna be okay. Just let me say goodbye to the transmission, to this live. Coders, los dejamos. Ojalá que hayan disfrutado esta plática con Donny. Son muchos tips que les venimos diciendo todos los días, ¿no? Pero como ya no hallamos, ¿no? Pues entonces hay que dárselos en español, en inglés. Yo creo que el día de mañana vamos a traer a alguien en portugués, ¿no? Y luego en alemán, no sé. La idea es que ustedes entiendan, ¿no? Toda esta serie de soft skills, de oportunidades que tienen y que tenemos que desarrollar, ¿no? Y que tenemos que seguir desarrollando. Y eso no solamente es para ustedes, es para uno mismo también, ¿no? Entonces, ojalá que hagan caso de estos tips. Ahí está la comunidad, los invitamos a que se unan a la comunidad y nos vemos en la siguiente. Únanse al Telegram de Kodemia Devs. Escucharon a Donny hablando de comunidad. Ahí está el Telegram de Kodemia Devs. Donny, I invite you to join us to our community in Telegram at Kodemia Devs. There are a lot of questions, and if you want to answer questions or you have questions also, well, just do it. Entonces, está la comunidad ahí en Kodemia Devs. Somos más de 600. There's more than 600 people in there, Tony. Hay más de 600.
Nice.
Hay más de 600 personas ahí respondiendo, haciendo preguntas. Si tienen, ya estoy todo pocho. Si tienen alguna pregunta, si tienen un código que no está funcionando, si tienen lo que sea, una duda existencial sobre desarrollo, lo que sea, pónganla en Telegram y seguramente alguien de nosotros lo vamos a responder. Estamos los egresados, los mentores. Ahora estamos invitando a Donny. Péguense a la comunidad y ese es gratuito, por supuesto, así que aprovechenla, ¿vale? Muchas gracias a todos. Once again, Donny, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming with us. Hasta luego, Colors. Buen día, nos vemos en la noche.